In October 2014, I purchased this 1973 Volkswagen Super Beetle. It would be my 9th vintage VW and my 3rd Super Beetle. I was really looking for something a bit older and just a regular Beetle, but the price on this one was too good to pass up. I immediately began to disassemble the car, hoping to get most of the bigger bits and pieces off before the weather turned too cold to work outside. This was a true Kentucky Beetle and the body was in really good shape, just a little rust here and there. The quarter panels, heater tubes, inside the wheel wells and the floor pans were remarkably rust-free. Not typical for a Beetle this old. The interior had a lot to be desired. These dashes are one reason that I'm not a fan of the later Super Beetles. The dash can be fixed, but it's very laborious and not cheap. I'll leave a link in the description that details the complete teardown of this car, complete with the body removed from the floor pan. Over the winter months, my main focus was going to be on the engine. This engine had been rebuilt 3 years earlier but had experienced an electrical fire a few months later. The car then sat outside for 2.5 years before I bought it. The engine had excellent compression and fired right up when first tested and bypassing unnecessary wiring. Somebody had really gone to town with the paint when the engine was last taken apart. We'll do our best to correct that. Most of the tins were in pretty good shape, some were missing and some needed to be replaced. Sitting out in the elements had really taken its toll on this poor little engine. On November 15, 2014, 1 month after purchasing the car, I began to tear down the engine. I'd still do little things to prep the body, but my main focus was on the engine. I still didn't know how far I'd go with it. I'd know more once the heads and jugs were removed and I could give it a better inspection. I also began to put together a detailed list of parts that I'd be replacing and parts that I'd be upgrading. Parts that I was keeping got an immediate cleaning to remove oxidation, mud, and rust. While the teardown continued, new parts began to trickle in. All parts that I was going to keep were inspected, cleaned, stripped, and prepared for their new life. This part was very time-consuming, but satisfying as well. Inspection of the heads, pistons, and jugs gave me great hope. Besides some paint and oxidation, they were in very good shape. Again, I wasn't denying the body its due attention, I was just more focused on the engine. In the evenings after work, I'd concentrate on one part of the engine. One piece at a time. I wouldn't start on a new piece until the one I was working on was finished. New parts kept arriving as I continued to prep other parts. It's important to mention that this wasn't the original engine to the car. This was actually a Type 3 engine. I'll probably mention this many times, but it was very satisfying to see these parts clean up and prep to use again. Yes, it would have been just as easy to order replacement parts for everything, but what fun is that? Some parts such as the oil pump cover weren't worth the effort to clean, prep and paint. Since these parts were relatively inexpensive, they were replaced with new parts. More expensive parts, such as the alternator, were taken to a local auto parts store to be tested. If they passed the test, they were cleaned and prepped to be reused. For the most part, I was able to reuse about 70% of the original tin. In a last-minute decision, I decided to order a replacement aftermarket doghouse and some of the outer tins. And as I mentioned before, this motor was originally used in a Type 3. Probably a notchback, wagon, or fastback. Therefore, the placement of the dipstick was different than that of a Beetle. I had to modify some spare tins that I had to accommodate the dipstick tube for a Type 3. If you aren't subscribed to our channel yet, please take a moment to do so. On December 15th, 2 months after purchasing the Beetle, I began to clean the case, replace the piston rings and prep everything to have it ready to put back together. I checked the end play on the crankshaft and averaged right at 4 thousandths. That is totally acceptable. As for cleaning the case, this was very time-consuming. I don't know what kind of paint the previous owner used to paint the case, intake, heads and valve covers, but it was a bear to get off. Lots of paint stripper and elbow grease and things finally began to clean up nicely. Christmas was coming a bit early. I nearly had all of the parts needed to put the engine back together. With all of the engine tins prepped and painted, it was a great feeling to begin reassembly. I was sure to give the paint on the engine tins plenty of time to cure. Since it was the middle of December, the garage was still pretty cold and keeping it warm enough to paint and work was a task. The fuel pump that came on the engine worked fine, but I inadvertently ordered a new one and decided to use it. The original went into the parts bin to use on another project. I also ordered a new distributor, but it hadn't arrived yet. Torque specs for all of the nuts and bolts are readily available on the internet. Invest into a nice torque wrench, it'll make your life a lot easier. I also recommend buying a quality gasket kit. Again, they're readily available from reputable vendors. Stay away from anything made in China. I don't think that I'd mentioned before that this is a 1600 dual-port engine. I can't wait to fire it back up for the first time since it was removed from the car. Unfortunately, in 2014, I wasn't creating any videos, so you're seeing mostly still shots in this video. Most rebuild gasket kits come with enough seals and gaskets for many different engines. Make sure you're using the correct seals during reassembly, especially around the oil cooler. One part that is often overlooked on engines with this particular doghouse and oil cooler is the hoover bit that mounts to the oiled cooler stand. They always seem to get lost because they're so small. Since the new distributor hadn't arrived yet, I went ahead and put new old stock, points, condenser, rotor and distributor cap on the original distributor. Everything is cleaning up nicely. Again, check and double check that you are using the proper tins for your engine. The tins are vital for proper cooling and you want to make sure that you're using the correct ones. I also installed new exhaust studs in both heads. And just like that, the new distributor arrived. I still hadn't decided if I was going to use it or the original. The carburetor was in horrible condition. It was caked with mud and soot. It would eventually clean up nicely and I installed a rebuild kit. It seems like I was always painting tins and letting them cure for days. The end result was worth the wait and patience. Just before Christmas, it was time to start reassembly of the jugs and heads. Again, this is when you'll appreciate a quality torque wrench and ring compressor. Unfortunately, I used a cheap ring compressor, but it still worked well. It also wouldn't hurt to have an extra set of hands to help you out. You certainly don't want to rush this process. Double check all of your torque specs and keep everything square. I was going to order some new, old stock valve covers, but these aluminum covers looked really nice and they cleaned up well. Ignore that nasty blue paint. It was just too hard to remove from the cooling fins. Like I mentioned before, whatever paint they used was very tough and it didn't want to be removed easily. Other than the paint that I couldn't remove, everything else looks really nice. The engine tins have turned out better than expected. I've also already installed the new distributor and fuel pump. Next will be the new oil sending unit and the reconditioned generator stand. I'm installing the engine tins with new screws and washers. These are stainless steel, so rust should never be a problem in the future. You can also see how I had to modify the tin that surrounds the dipstick tube. With the alternator installed, it's really beginning to look like an engine again. I'll give the intake tubes one more good cleaning and polish before installing them. Just when I thought that I was finished painting engine tins, I found one that I forgot. Also, as I mentioned before, don't forget that Hoover bit that mounts to the oil cooler stand. With the last of the engine tins ready to be installed, I began to concentrate on the exhaust. I wasn't sure what the final setup would be, so for the time being, I was going to install some J-pipes that I had. The J-pipes got their fair share of attention as well. They both got a coat of heat-resistant paint and a good layer of heat wrap. As we brought in the new year, the engine was nearing completion. Since I had been posting updates on a popular VW forum, I began to get offers for the engine. I had explained that I had no intention of selling it without the body and just left it at that. The starter was also very dirty but tested fine. It got a really good cleaning as well and was prepped for its new life. The intake was cleaned thoroughly and any carbon was removed from the heat risers. I thought about replacing it, but it cleaned up nicely and I gave it a good coat of heat-resistant paint. With the carburetor rebuilt, it was time to marry it back to the intake and install on the engine. I'll link my video to a carb rebuild in the description below. This is one of the very few videos that I did record just before the engine was ready to test fire. I really like the black on the intake. I finally decided to use the new doghouse. The original doghouse wasn't very rusty, but the metal was ripped in many different places and cracks as long as 3 inches. I added it to the parts bin to address at a later date. Later, I installed riv nuts to the front of the doghouse so I could mount the coil. While I was working inside of a decently warm garage, it was snowing pretty good outside. At this point, it was mainly detail work. Double-checking all of the connections, torque specs, etc. Even the little details matter, like adding a rubber grommet to the modified tin where the dipstick tube protrudes. I purchased a new riv nut gun just to be able to mount the coil to the doghouse. I had never used riv nuts before, but now, I use them often. I had a spare air filter housing that would eventually go on the engine, but like everything else, it needed a lot of love and care. I really hate these types of air cleaners, but this was just a temporary setup to keep anything from falling down the carburetor. Static timing was set and any potential vacuum leaks were plugged. At last, the rest of the engine tins were installed. Even the ones that are specific when using J-pipes. It was hard to believe that in just a little over a month and a half, we'd gone from this to this. We were so excited to reach this milestone and prepare for the next step. However, the next step would never come. On Valentine's Day, 2015, the whole scope of the project changed. The day started like any other Valentine's Day. The wife and I exchanged gifts and sat down to plan the day. For the previous couple of weeks, I had been watching a couple of Beetles that were for sale. One was in Cincinnati, Ohio, the other was in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Out of the blue, we decided to make a day trip and go look at the Beetle that was in Cincinnati. We called up the fella that was selling the Beetle and he had no problem with us dropping in to give it a drive. Cincinnati is a good 2.5 hour drive from home, so we grabbed some cash and headed out the door. The Beetle had been marketed as being in excellent condition with no rust. The pictures that we had received from the fella who was selling it certainly indicated that there was no visible rust. He was asking $8,000 for the car. Less than 3 hours after leaving our house, we pulled into the driveway where this Beetle was sitting. At first glance, she was a beauty. The gentleman met us as we were walking towards the car, gave us a brief history of his ownership and handed us the keys. Without hesitation, the wife and I got into the car and started it. It wasn't a true cold start because he had driven the car from the back side of the house before we arrived, but it did start pretty easily and sounded pretty good. No visible smoke or burning oil. We assured him that the drive would be quick, just around the block and down the highway just a bit. Unfortunately, I quickly discovered that the car had little to no brakes and pulled horribly to the passenger side when the brakes were applied. This wasn't a deal changer, but I did have to drive the car 3 hours back home if we purchased it. I pulled into a service station to give the car a good inspection. It didn't take long to realize that the car wasn't in the condition in which it was marketed. The heater channels had gaping holes in them, the fender wells had holes that were freshly filled with tar and spray foam. Within a few minutes, it was obvious that we weren't going to be interested in purchasing the car. Besides, we had a Super Beetle sitting in the garage at home that was in much better condition. We returned the car to the owner, let him know our thoughts, and hit the road again. I decided to give the guy in Bowling Green a call to see if he'd be interested in meeting with us in Lexington, Kentucky. Lexington was going to be another hour and 20-minute drive for us and about an hour and a half drive for him if he was interested. To my surprise, he was more than willing to make the drive with the Beetle and meet us there. The wife and I were pretty hungry, so we decided to go to Ted's Montana Grill in Lexington, eat, then meet up with the next Beetle owner at a shopping center there. Within the next 3 hours, we'd made the trip to Lexington, had a wonderful Valentine's Day dinner at Ted's, and within 10 minutes of finishing our meal, the owner with the next Beetle arrived. I had already seen a lot of pictures of this Beetle from every possible angle and had spoken with the owner multiple times. I really wanted this Beetle, but had never set aside the time to go see it. It was on the other side of the state from me. Even better, he was only asking $6,500 for it. As with the previous Beetle we had visited, we gave this Beetle a quick test drive around the plaza and knew right away that we were going to make an offer. It drove wonderfully and everything on it worked. We offered $6,000 for it, he accepted, we knocked out the paperwork, shook hands, and headed off in our own directions. It really was a fast transaction, but like I mentioned, we had spoken multiple times already. Now we had to face the next problem. A quick call to the insurance company and we were ready to hit the road. The drive from Lexington to Ashland was going to be another 2 hours. I really wanted to be home by dark, and even though it had been sunny all day, it began to snow. Not just a little snow, but a lot of snow. Before we even made it to the interstate, the roads were covered and it was snowing so hard that you could barely see 30 feet in front of you. Luckily, the Beetle had good wipers and the wife stayed close behind me in her car. Without dragging this story out much longer, let me just say that the next 3 hours was white-knuckle driving all the way home. We actually had to stop a couple of times because the roads disappeared beneath the snow. We'd have to wait for a couple of semi-trucks to pass by to give us a clear indication of where the road was, then we'd take off again in the blinding snow. But we made it without incident and the Beetle performed like a champ. When we were less than 10 miles from the house, the sun came out, melted what snow had stuck to the roads and made the rest of trip very enjoyable. Regardless, I never want to do it again. The kicker to this whole story is that I got a call from a guy in Youngstown, Ohio before we left Lexington. He had expressed interest in the Super Beetle a few times before and he said that something told him to give me another call. He was a Super Beetle only kind of guy, mainly interested in later model Super Beetles. It was just too good to be true, all of these pieces of the puzzle falling into place at once, it was like it was meant to be. Since I was in an exceptionally good mood, I agreed to sell him the Super Beetle, the motor and a bunch of other parts that I had accumulated the past 2 months. It was certainly a weird day, a long day and the best Valentine's Day ever. He met us at our home about 15 minutes after we arrived from Lexington. He didn't experience any snow during his drive from Youngstown. We spent another couple of hours loading the motor into his truck, securing the floor pan back to the body and loading up parts. He spent another 5 months working on the Super Beetle and finally finished it in late summer of 2015. He put it back to its original glory. This video was supposed to be mainly about the refresh of the 1600 Type 3 engine that came out of a Super Beetle that I bought without giving it too much thought. But I felt that I had to elaborate at least a little bit more to tell the whole story. There's still a lot more to the story, but I don't want this video to be any longer than it already is. As you probably know, we still have that 68 Beetle that we bought on Valentine's Day 2015 and I seriously doubt that we'll ever consider selling it. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel. Be sure to check out the description for links to various tools and products used while we refreshed the Super Beetle engine. As always, thanks for watching.